Masters in Environmental Change and Management, and it's my a great pleasure really to introduce Patrick Meyfroidt to you. He's a professor at the Catholic University in Louvain and has worked for several years on kind of understanding land use in Africa and South America in a number of different commodities. And I'm really excited that Patrick is able to come and talk to us because his work involves synthesizing a number of different approaches and methodologies that are often employed in isolation. So yeah, there's many fascinating angles to his work. Today he's going to be talking about understanding agricultural frontiers, their emergence in Southern and Eastern Africa, and talking about this interdisciplinary approach, combining ethnography, remote sensing, and decision-making models. Yeah, I'll hand over to him shortly, but do post your questions in the chat, yeah, if you're able to, then I'll probably invite you to ask your question afterwards. Otherwise, I can kind of forward them on. So without further ado, over to you, Patrick.
Okay, thank you very much. I will just share. I have to. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so do you see the screen, everything correctly? Yes? Okay. So, well, first of all, of course, thank you very much, Yadminder and Mark and everyone for inviting me. I'm very honored and pleased to be speaking here. I hope that you will enjoy and learn something useful. So the goal of the talk is to describe this project that we're working on since a few years about understanding agricultural frontiers, emergence in Southern and Eastern Africa. I will come back to unpack a little bit these words and what is the goal of the project. And we're using, yes, an interdisciplinary approach. I think this will become clear, and we'll see if this really has a value. I'm fine with having questions in the chat or along the way if people have. I don't have a problem with that. I'm just maybe not going to look at the chat. So if there is a question that maybe Mark think it is relevant to ask, don't hesitate to like interrupt me along the way. Okay, so it's a project that, of course, that is done with a rather diverse and large team. I see that a few of the people of the team are there in the audience. So if I'm telling stupid things, they can correct me. So both at the University of Louvain and our colleagues at the University Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique. And it's in the framework of a larger project, so a ERC project that is running since 2016. That is called Developing Middle Range Theories Linking Land Use, Displacement, Intensification, and Transitions. I'm not going to expand more on middle range theories of land use change today, but if you wanted to hear or see more about this, you can refer to the paper that is there. I think that's the best I have to offer for the moment on this. Many of the work that I'm going to describe is not yet published. Something is under review, in preparation, and so on. But all the working papers and the preprints are on the website of the project. So if you want to go more in depth about a number of topics, because the goal of my presentation was to show a little bit how we articulate different pieces together. So maybe I'm going to be a bit too shallow on some of the parts that you are interested in, but you can find more details there. The roadmap broadly is in 3 parts. So I will start by describing a little bit this notion of frontier and the bigger framing of the project and why we decided to frame the project as it is. Then I'm going to jump in more in the actual empirics of what we have done and found in Mozambique and in the countries around. And you will see that we'll move across scale from things on a very local scale to going beyond and trying to realize findings from these. And then I will say a few words on what we can learn from the project in terms of governance and policy. This is not the area in which we have made the strongest progress, I think, because I think we really needed to have a proper understanding before going further in terms of policies or whatever. Okay, so first part, what do we mean by frontiers? I think many of you probably have an idea about what they mean about frontiers. For us, we restarted from the use of this term by the American historian Frederick Jackson Turner, who wrote about the notion of frontier as this wave that was making civilization progressing across America over the time of the country, and how this progress of people and civilization was really a critical part, not only for the foundation of the country on the economic point of view or political point of view, but also in terms of the identity or the value of America. I think this last part, what extent the frontiers really matters for the values of the United States and so on, is quite contested now, but doesn't matter so much. I think the original idea of frontier is still valid. From that, like this initial idea, there's been a lot of works that explored what are the implications and the different dimension of this notion of frontier. So building on Turner's works, there's a number of work which describe frontiers as this process of pushing back wilderness. So the process where civilization expands, civilization and development expands by taming the natural world. There's a number of authors who describe frontiers as spaces where there's a rapidly expanding force. So the places where there's opportunities, if those who want really to contribute or to benefit from this expanding force, they can find these opportunities in frontiers. Some authors also describe frontiers as places where the people who are there, or newly arriving people, extract or exploit some natural resources that can be new resource, or that can be reinvented resource that were there, but for which we find new purposes. And spaces of territorialization, so spaces where institutional actors like government or large companies organize the territory in a way that they can handle it with, that they can govern it, or they can pull out benefits from it. And because, as you have seen in the previous picture from the painting, these frontiers are often not places of wilderness. They are usually places where there's actually a very long time. So frontiers have also been described as these places of friction between different worlds. So where different kinds of economies, different cultures interact, sometimes positively, sometimes conflictually. So from all that, we build on all this, and we build on all this, but we really work with our working definition of frontiers as resource frontiers. There's an imbalance between, on the one hand, there's an abundance of some kind of natural resource, and on the other hand, there's a comparative lack of production factors, so capital or labor, to exploit this resource. And as a result of this imbalance, there's a rapid expansion of this resource use. From this notion of resource frontiers, we can turn that into a definition of land use frontiers, where the resource actually is land. So there's abundant land and a rapid expansion of land use. And the notion of deforestation frontier derives from that as a kind of counterpart, where much of land use expansion, agricultural expansion, forestry expansion comes at the expense of forest. In contemporary context, as I think many of you know and are working on this, many of these frontiers are driven by large-scale capitalized actors who produce commodities for international, domestic, or global markets. So this is the kind of frontiers on which we are focusing on to a large extent. How do these frontiers work? How is it that at some point there is a resource, an abundance of resource, but in many cases these resources are not used? There's plenty of places in the planet where there is land, but there is not agriculture. This is a work that we did a few years ago with Yann Le Paulin de Warou, and we tried to conceptualize what was driving these frontiers. And what we try to propose is that at some point there is some kind of increase in the economic rent that can be derived from the land. Maybe there's a new accessibility, there's new crops and new technologies which allows at least some actors to really benefit from land in a way that was impossible before. In a perfect market conditions, if things were really working as in the economic textbooks, the bid rent would increase at the same time. The bid rent is the price that people are willing to pay to acquire land. So if land has gained some value, people would be willing to pay more, and basically the price for the land, so the bid rent, would match the economic rent. But in many contexts in frontiers, it's not the case. The economic rent increases, but the bid rent does not increase because some actors do not have access to land for some tenure reason, because the information is not clear, because only some actors know about the potential of the frontiers and so on. And so this creates this abnormal rent that you see on the graph. So this imbalance between there is the potential for some actors at least to really benefit a lot from the land and to acquire it at a very cheap price. And this is what we hypothesize is driving this rush for land, because actors want to absorb, to incorporate as much as possible of this abnormal rent for the time when it exists. We'll return to that a little bit later. Okay, so why do we study commodity frontiers in particular? So these frontiers driven by large-scale capitalized actors producing for commercial activities, because this is something that I really don't have to tell to you all, because there's a lot of environmental implications. Lots of these commodity frontiers happen at the expense of tropical forests or tropical woodlands or savannas or other kinds of natural habitat. And there's also a lot of human implications. There's a lot of people who are living in these frontiers, doing subsistence, semi-subsistence, some commercial activity. Of these frontiers bring a lot of issues and implications in terms of things like land grabbing, for example, but which can also be positive implications in terms of possible synergies between these kinds of capitalized agriculture and what smallholders are doing. Why did we decide to focus on frontiers in tropical dry forest, like in Mozambique and the region around? Because these are quite neglected environments. There's much less studies on these than on humid tropical forest, and still they are highly threatened environments. So this is a work, a map prepared by Anna Büchadas, a PhD student in Humboldt University in Berlin, where we try to map different kinds of frontiers in tropical dry forest, and we see that at least 1/3 of the remaining tropical dry forest deforestation frontier. So in regions where there is actually rapid and sustained deforestation. So they are quite threatened environments and understood. But of course, they are environments where there's a lot of environmental value and social stakes and so on. Why do we need an interdisciplinary approach like I'm going to describe? Because what happens in this frontier is often not easily captured by standard economic theories. So if we would be able to just function with classical economics, we would probably not need much of the interdisciplinary approach that I'm going to describe. But this is a work led by Felix Hagenbrot in Southampton. And what we did is a global land use model based on standard economic theories, Tunen and Ricardo. And what we show is that these standard economic theories based on accessibility, climate, soil suitability of land. They actually predict the presence of croplands across the planet quite well, but they are quite poor to predict recent expansion of cropland. So this frontiers progressing on the margins of cropland extent. This standard economic trend theories describe that very, explain that very badly or poorly. What you see in the map is this dark purple color that you can see here. These are the places where there is much more cropland in 1992 than predicted by the standard economic models, but so the model underpredict cropland there. Also a lot of more recent expansion after 1992. So basically it shows that these past frontier dynamics, so the cropland that happened there, which is not explained by standard economic theories, can help to predict future frontiers. So this is a little bit the rationale for the work that I'm going to explain later, is that if we understand the past frontier dynamics that do not fit into standard economic theories, we can maybe help to understand what's going to happen next. Okay, last kind of framing point. Why do we study frontiers emergence? There's a lot of works focusing on these really active frontiers like Mato Grosso in Brazil or Mato Piba region and so on. And this is of course highly useful, but the fact is that in many of these active frontiers, there's a lot of economic, political interest and lock-ins, which make these frontiers for more sustainable outcomes when they are really at the scale and at the functioning as shown in this picture from Mato Grosso. So we wanted to have a look at those places that are not frontiers for the moment, but might become frontiers at some point. And with the idea that if we understand what happens in these early stages of frontier, we can maybe have a more proactive governance and steer the trajectories in a more sustainable direction from the start instead of coming up later, in a sense. Okay, so that was the general idea and framing. I think I hope that was sufficiently clear. Now, what we have been really working on in Mozambique in the region. Okay, we based on what I just said, I think the question from the project are quite clear. We're trying to understand how these frontiers. Why? So basically, why do some investors, which are capitalized and want to do commercial agriculture, why do they go in these places where there's currently very little commercial agriculture? What are the actors that do that? What are the logics and so on? And then, of course, how does it shape land use dynamics? And then is there a role for policies or other interventions in steering these? So we take a very much an investor's perspective, and there's a lot of work that focus on smallholders, including in questions of land grab. For example, there's a lot of work that try to understand the smallholders' perspective, smallholders' reactions, and especially impacts on smallholders. And this is all highly valuable work, but we felt that there was probably a gap in trying to understand what these investors want, what is their point of view, what is their perspective. And this is some of the work that we're trying to address in the project. So we work on this region of Southern and Eastern Africa relatively broadly. Why? Because this is one of the regions which is supposed to hold large reserve of land that is not yet converted to agriculture, and that, at least in some discourses, is considered as land that presents relatively low trade-offs in terms of carbon stocks or others. It's certainly not the case, but it's at least in the discourse, it's a case. And we take a multi-scale approach. So some of the work that we've been doing and that I'm going to explain is focused on more local scale. For example, mainly in this province of Nyasa in Northern Mozambique. But we also do work on a somewhat more regional scale of Northern Mozambique. And then we did some work that goes across the broader region to try to understand comparatively how the insights from this region can be compared to what happens in other regions. So we work with this multi-scale approach, and one of the reasons we worked on this was that working in South America, there were a lot of discourses about how policies in some of the places, in particular, for example, in the Brazilian Amazon after 2006, 2009, how policies were becoming constraining for land use expansion for agribusiness actors that were seeking new land to expand soybean fields or pastures, and that some of these actors were moving across the region to the Cerrado, to the Gran Chaco region, but also sometimes even further in the Miombo woodlands in southern Africa. So that was a hypothesis that we had in the start. I'm not sure that it's totally true, at least so far. I don't think that the Brazilian or Argentinian actors are super dominant in that region, but it may still happen at some point, and so still these connections are useful, I think, to keep in mind and to be proactive also on this. Okay, just I guess many of you are familiar with these environments, but just in case, the region we're working on is mainly a region of Miombo woodlands. So these are open canopy forest with adapted to a relatively long dry seasons and to frequent fires. I'm not expanding more on the ecology of these Miombo woodlands because you know this much better than me. But just to say, it's a region where there is still large tracts of relatively undisturbed natural habitat, but there's also landscapes that are settled by people, sometimes quite densely since a long time. So people doing smallholder agriculture and some commercial agriculture. So there is this mixture of large tracts of natural habitat and settled, more or less settled landscapes. Okay, so what did we do? We started, at least the presentation, the explanation here starts at the local level. And we started to work in this province of Nyasa in northern Mozambique, to some extent, because when you ask people in Mozambique, this is the place where they send you, in a sense. And we try to understand, okay, who are these pioneers, these very relatively few people, investors, commercial farmers that are really trying to do some kinds of commercial farming or commercial forestry in this region where there is really very little, and most of the agriculture is smallholder agriculture. So we worked on this ethnographic approach. This is mainly the work from Angela Cronenberg Garcia, who's a postdoc in the project, and we try to meet these pioneers and to try to understand what they were doing. So again, why this province of Nyasa? Because it is described as a province with very abundant land. So it's a province with a relatively low population density and with still relatively large expanses of land which are not used for agriculture. But it's also described as the forgotten province. So it's a relatively poor province, isolated with poor accessibility, that has been neglected or at least not very well connected with the national government for a long time. And so it's also a place where local, provincial, but also national governments have recently started to try to attract investors by trying to both use the natural resource of the region as a way to attract investors and use the investors as a way to promote economic development in the region. And this is shown, for example, in this map that you have on the left, which is a map used including by the Japanese corporation to show, to try to attract Brazilian investors by showing them that really this region in Mozambique is really comparable to the Cerrado region in Brazil. And the map that you see on the right, which was used in an investors forum to try to display all the areas in the province that were available land, so land that was not used by anyone, supposedly, are displayed in green in this map. So we try okay, we meet these people who are pioneers, farmers, and we try to basically ask them and try to understand why they were there, what they were doing there. And when asking that, many people referred to past events, and they were there because they were somehow the results of different waves of investors that came there in the past. Many of these waves of investors came and failed or struggled. So some of these waves of investors date from a very long time ago, already from colonial period or so on, but I'm just going to restart the story at the end of the Civil War, so that happened between pretty much the independence of Mozambique in 1975 up to 1992. And directly at the end of the Civil War, already there was a wave of missionary farmers that were coming mainly from South Africa, who came to this province because it was relatively isolated, because this was a place where they were feeling that they could contribute to spread the Christian religion, but also to develop agriculture and show the local people how to improve their agriculture. So this wave largely struggled, and as the quote said, life is hard on a family here. So these people realized that it was very isolated. It's hard for families, for children to be there, for the wives that had to be housewife and teaching the children and so on. And so many of these farmers ended up going back or going elsewhere or abandoning farming. Then came another wave of white South African commercial farmers that came through a partnership between the government of South Africa and the government in Mozambique, really to try to, from the Mozambican point of view, develop commercial agriculture in the region. And these white South African commercial farmers, they came with promises of support, and they were expecting to find good accessibility conditions and so on. But they arrived and they were to a large extent left to themselves. So they had to clear the land themselves, which is something that they were not used to do in their former farms. They had no electricity, no road, and so on. They had no support. And basically, as the quote said, they felt like they left us like a rotten potato. And so here again, many of these these farmers failed, struggled, went back, or abandoned agriculture. There was then a wave of large-scale forestry companies who were attracted by a partnership again between the government and cooperation, and companies, forestry companies from Nordic countries, mainly Sweden and others. And again, they came with the idea that the government was preparing the land, the ground for them by already securing land titles for these large-scale forestry companies. They came, they invested a lot, but they also struggled a lot for various reasons related to accessibility, to conflicts with local populations. And many of these initial companies sold their plantations to others or went bankrupt. Yeah. So this is the story of all these waves, these past waves, and then many of the people that we met were part of what we call a new wave, and this new wave of investors actually were to some extent coming from these past waves. So some were people who came as one of these past wave, maybe to work as a manager in one of these companies that were there and failed. Some were children of some of these missionary farmers that decided to return to Mozambique, or some were people who were local Mozambican people, but who had been working in some of these foreign companies, forestry companies, as a manager, as accountant, or others, and who decided to invest some of their savings in the agriculture, in developing commercial agriculture. So this is this new wave of investors, which is a mixture of locals and foreigners. And they're doing a very broad mix of farming of crops. So they diversify a lot. This is one picture from one of the farms where you have coffee in the foreground, you have some eucalyptus trees in the background, you have apple trees behind the photographer, and so on. And they're trying also to reutilize some of the things that were set up by some of these past waves, like irrigation canals or some infrastructure, some buildings. So the story that we come up with here is that some of these, but to a large extent, they left legacies in the landscape. So they left some traces, whether it's in terms of brownfields, so places that were cleared with infrastructure and electricity, in terms of land tenure titles that were delimited, in terms of social networks, in terms of approaches to deal with local populations in a more favorable way, for example. And at some point, these legacies are building, and okay, we hypothesize that at some point when these frontiers start to emerge, maybe because these legacies have been building in the background, it seems that nothing happens in this place, but actually there's a lot that is happening through these different waves and the legacies that they leave in the landscape. So this is from the ethnographic point of view. So we try to map these by remote sensing. We're still working on trying to map these waves of agriculture for field crops, but at least we managed so far to map the forestry companies, the tree plantation expansion in Northern Mozambique. So far it's still relatively small and tiny, so it's challenging from the remote sensing point of view. I will come back to that later, but it's just to show at this stage that we also try to actually map these land uses in the landscape. Okay, so this is about the past, but in fact, many of these new we met and discussed with, they said that they were there for some reasons related to the past, as I explained, but they were also thinking about the future. And so we started to work with this notion of economies of anticipation in anthropology. So how these orientations of people towards the future, speculations, hopes that people have about the future influence their land use. And there we see an interesting connections between the province of Nyasa that I described, which is very much an agricultural province, and the neighboring province of Cabo Delgado, where there is a large richness in terms of mineral resource, mining activities. As you see on the map there, pretty much the whole province is covered by mining exploration licenses. For gold, ruby, there's a lot of fossil fuels, so oil and natural gas and graphite. So what the people explain is that they were also making land use decisions in anticipation of the boom that they expected in this mining sector. So many of these new waves of farmers were investing in some high value crops like meat or fruits or coffee, in the anticipation of having commercial activities, economic development, and a community of expats, for example, that would come to work for these mining companies that appear in the region and that would require products like fruits and meats and so on. Okay, so these are just pictures to illustrate these farmers investing in meat and fruits, for example. So this is just to show that the strategic anticipation of the future also matters in terms of the land use trajectory. Even if this mining does not necessarily exist currently, still it already influences land use today. I just have to say that, of course, the situation in reality is much more complex, and it's a very unstable region. So the last few years, especially in this province of Cabo Delgado, has been very unstable with insurgencies that maybe you have heard on the news or elsewhere that are linked to some extent to Islamic terrorism. and which create a lot of instability. And basically, currently, the mining companies and the oil and gas companies have shut down. So the expectations that people had about this economic boom of mining is not materializing for the moment, but still, it has influenced land use nevertheless. Okay, so from that, we took a larger perspective, and this is the work mainly from Delini Abaigunawardan, which is also a postdoc in the project. And we try to take a broader perspective on the region and try to meet and interview transnational forestry and agricultural companies and investors, so companies that were investing in these different countries in the region, to try to better understand why they were deciding to invest in some place and not in other places, and what they were really looking for in these places. So we did, well, mainly Delini, of course, did a lot of interviews with trying to really cover the whole chain of people in these companies. So from the local farm managers, the country or the regional, the chief investment officers, who are sometimes our CEOs who are in London or Amsterdam, because all these different people, they have they hold a different part of the reality and the knowledge and reality of why the investment took place there and what's happening in the ground. So with all these interviews, we created a Bayesian network model. Okay, so this is just to illustrate the very wide diversity of investments. So these investors, they focus on very different crops, very different scales, very different business models. So there's this whole diversity. So with that, we build a Bayesian model. I'm not going to enter into the technicalities of the Bayesian model, see, but that's not really what matters here. The logic of the model is on the left. Basically, what is the logic? The logic of the model is to start with information that we have from the interviews and companies' records and so on, about the investors' track records. And these track records is something that we kind of characterize based on the experience that the companies and the investors have in farming, in forestry, in the similar crops of a given investment, whether they have experience in the region, and whether they have some market control. So to what extent they are a company that matters in terms of setting the markets or not. So from this investor track record, we model how it influences the choices of productions. What are the kind of crops that people are working on, decided to invest on. It also influences the investment selection criteria. So what are the criteria that investors will really take care of, and which are the ones that are going to be maybe less interesting for them. And all of this influences the investment location, where they decide to invest. So where they decide to invest, we characterize this. Well, we have the location of the investments from field visits or others, and we characterize this based on a set of spatial data. And because we want to understand this logic of investment decisions, we try to characterize this location of investments along two axes. One is this axis of resource frontier that I mentioned earlier. So to what extent the land that there is in the area of the investment, there is a relative abundance of land that is not yet converted to agriculture and with relatively small population density. So this is a high resource frontier area. And another axis of something that we hypothesize might attract investors is agglomeration economies. So the presence of already established commercial activities and other commercial farming and forestry in the region is a promise of agglomeration economies. So the possibility for new investors to benefit from a pool of skilled labor force, for good roads, from service providers, from good markets, and things like that. So sometimes investors have to make kind of trade-off between resource frontiers and agglomeration economies, and this is what we want to model. So with all the data that we have in the Bayesian network, basically we try to show how different kinds of profiles of investors invest in different places along these two axes. I'm not going to explain all of this in detail, but I'm just going to pick two examples to really illustrate this well. So we show that, for example, there is a pool of investors which have a very extensive track record. So there are investors who know crops, who have been doing farming for a long time in these specific crops, who know the region. They also have other farms in the region and so on, and who focus on very high value crops that grow in certain conditions, high value fruits or quality coffee or others. And these ones, we see that they invest mainly in this subsistence frontier. So places where there is not a lot of commercial activity, but there is the abundant land where they can expect that they will really going to find the nice land that has the proper agronomic, climatic, soil, etc. conditions to really grow the high value crops that they care about. In contrast, there is a very different set of investors, a pool of investors which has no experience at all, no track records. Sometimes they have never done farming, they don't know the place and so on. So these are essentially like financial investors who are looking for a good financial product to invest with. And these invest predominantly in these emerging commercial frontiers where you already have some economic activity, some commercial farmings, but there's still a relative abundance of land, and there they expect that they can acquire land that is going to gain value as these agglomeration economies build over time. So really just showing that there is a very diverse pool of investors which have different assets and who make very different decisions with different logics when they invest. Okay, then we are able to use the data that we have to map these different regions, and we identify, for example, these subsistence frontiers in Northern Mozambique, in Nyasa that I was talking about, so with relatively little commercial activity and relative abundance of unconverted land, and some of these nexus of emerging commercial frontier with some commercial activity that is building. And so we expect that in these different places, we will find different kinds of investors attracted for different reasons. Okay, so from that, if I'm starting to be too long, please interrupt me because I see that the time is already, I started a bit later, but okay, if at some point I have to stop, don't hesitate to tell me. Okay, so from that, we try to think, okay, can we go a little bit one step further in generalization, and can we try to model this from the theoretical point of view? And this is the work from Virginia Rodriguez Garcia, a PhD student in the project. And what she did is to try to conceptualize this frontier process as a regime shift. So a shift from different stable equilibrium of land use. So from one state, which is a state of semi-subsistence land use, where you have smallholders doing a mix of crops, some for subsistence, some for some commercial activity, and some natural habitat in the landscape, and some mix of that. And another stable state, which is a landscape which is dominated by commodity crops and commercial land use. It can be large-scale agriculture, as you see in the picture there, but it can be also smallholder dominated, like in this picture in central highlands of Vietnam, where practically the whole landscape is covered by coffee farming. Okay, we try to understand this shift from a state where the landscape is on the one side to the other side, and we represent this as this variable S, which represent the proportion of the landscape that is covered by commercial crops and commercial activities. And we use a very simple stylized economic model, but just to help us think about this. And the model basically builds on this income function, which represent the aggregate income of all the farmers in the landscapes. And this income is divided in three parts. Some of the income is derived from this the part of the landscape that is used for this semi-subsistence basket of crops. And so we normalize this profit to 1 to say this is the basic profit. If we do commercial crop, we have a different profit. So this is the first part of the general income of the landscape. Second part is the profit that is derived from commercial crops. And of course, it depends on the proportion of the landscape that is covered by this commercial crop, so S. But the profit per unit also depends on the amount of commercial crops in the landscape. So basically, this model represents agglomeration economies, where the more there is commercial activity in the landscape, the more each unit of commercial activity, each ton produced of commercial crop or each hectare of commercial crop generates a higher profit because you benefit from agglomeration economies for reducing your costs, for example, or for obtaining higher price at the markets. And then there is a cost. So if you want to shift from your semi-subsistence to the commercial crop, or if you're a foreign investor and you want to invest in the landscape, there is some kind of transaction costs, some cost to shift from one to the other to invest in the place. So basically you have to invest and regain that in the future. So I'm quite short on the mathematical aspects, but basically we try to maximize this profit function to see what are the conditions under which the landscape will be dominated by semi-subsistence or by commercial crops. And what we see is that depending on the parameter space and the main parameters on the model, which are in the equation that you just saw, there are two different situations. One is a situation that you see here on the left, where basically the outcome, whether the landscape is dominated by subsistence or by commercial crop, is really only depending on what we call history. So basically the amount of agglomeration economies, which is driven by the amount of commercial crop in the landscape. So if you have this axis S, which measures how much of the landscape is commercial activity, you have this S star point. If you have more commercial activities than S star, it generates a lot of agglomeration economies. So the profit from commercial crop farming is high. And so all the farmers will turn to commercial crops. And at some point at the equilibrium, the whole landscape is going to be commercial crops. If you are below this S star value, basically commercial crops don't generate a lot of agglomeration economies because there's not a lot in the landscape simply. So the transaction cost for investing in more commercial crops is the benefits. And in the end of the day, all farmers will turn to subsistence activities. So this is one possibility, but in reality, depending on the parameter space, sometimes in one situation, basically mathematically, you have to make the square root of a negative value. And so you end up with complex numbers. And the solution space looks like what you have on the right, which means that there is a region in the space between S1 and S2 where the outcome, whether you end up with all commercial crops or all subsistence crops, depend not only on the past value and the agglomeration economies, but also depends on this axis Q, which is the expected profits from the farmers. And if you slightly change the profits that farmers expect to gain, you will end up in one or the other equilibrium. So basically, this frontier takes off and turns into a whole commercial crop landscape depends on what people expect to gain. We try to calibrate this model with a series of frontiers in actual landscapes in Indonesia and in Mato Grosso and so on. And what we saw is that most of these frontiers are in the parameter space where where expectations give the answer in sense. So it's depending on if people really believe that the frontier will work, then it will work. In a summary, this is it. Okay, I have my third part. I don't know if I still have time or if you think I should stop there.
It'd be,
it's a
I
short
don't know if you can kind of summarize in a few minutes. It'd be really nice to bring it up for questions. It's really interesting in this section. So maybe, wrap up, if like, summarize if possible, open up to questions.
Yeah, I will try to summarize very briefly, but basically we're not like at the stage where we are recommending policies or whatever, but we try to highlight a few challenges for policies in the region. The first is that there's huge monitoring gaps. Basically, there's very poor data on everything that happens in the region. This is just the remote sensing exercise showing that about 40% of the tree plantations that we can map have no cadastral record or don't fall into cadastral records. Second aspect that we're trying to investigate the effectiveness of a series of land use policy instruments. This is the place where if I start to explain this, it will probably take a bit too long, but I would just maybe say one word on this community lands, because this is something that I think is challenging and interesting. Maybe some people have interest in that. There is a law in Mozambique that allows communities to register the lands and to delineate that. And so if investors want to acquire land use rights on some of these lands, they have to negotiate with the communities. And there's a lot of question to what extent this law is supposed to empower local communities. But in reality, some argue that it can also attract investment by really putting these communities on the map for investors to identify the places where they actually can find a stakeholder to invest. We try to assess that with the land use maps that we have and some statistical matching analysis of the tree plantation expansion. The bottom line is we see relatively unclear effects of these community lands. So on whether they attract tree plantation, large-scale tree plantation investments, or to what extent they hinder it. It's not clear at all. And then we try to show that there is a lot of benefits in terms of governance that can be gained from adopting a more strategic approach, because there's a lot of structural factors that hinder governance in the region. That strategic approach, strategic spatial planning, as is used in many of the European land use planning, can help on that. Okay, very short, but just to conclude, we try to show that there's a number of blind spots in dry forest in frontier emergence that we're trying to contribute to shed a little bit of light on. Try to show that the past, these waves and these legacies, but also the future, people's expectations, can help to understand this non-linear dynamics frontier emergence. If I want you to remember something about the land use dynamics there, it's that it's very dynamic and it's very heterogeneous. There's a lot of different trajectories, and some of these regions are really taking off in terms of commercial agriculture, others are probably collapsing or lagging, and there's a huge diversity of investors. So we really show there's a diversity beyond the usual speculators and land grabbers story, which exists, of course, but there's much more than that. So I think the question is how can we attract the right investors in investment that can actually benefit local development and sustainability. Okay, then we have some steps ongoing, but I'm not going to talk about this now. But just to say also that there is a lot of work to do in this region. There's a lot of data gaps in everything: environmental data, ecological data, land use data, cadastral data, etc. So I think it's a nice place to work with if you're interested to contribute to, to work in this region where there's a lot of demands and not a lot of people working on. And that's it. Thank you. Sorry, a bit long.
Great. Thank you very much. That's brilliant. There's, I guess it'd be nice to, if you stop sharing your screen, Patrick, and people can switch on their cameras if they're able to, then we can see each other. That'd be nice. Does anyone have a question they wanted to ask? You can either stick your hand up, stick it in the chat, or just yeah, jump in. Connie.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, thanks for a fascinating talk, Patrick. That was so much material in there, and so many different methodologies that you're using. It's really exciting to see the work that you're doing. I have a number of questions, but I thought, let me see if I can articulate this. I'm not sure how clear I'm gonna be. But I remember early in your talk, you made a comment about how it's relatively easy to predict the extent of farming, but not expansion. Can you remind me so in terms of extent, what the key variables are? And then maybe if you could do that first, and then I'll ask my follow-up question to that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's this global land use modeling exercise where we just pick the standard variables that are supposed to predict cropland presence in standard economic theories, basically related to rent, so accessibility, soil suitability, good climate conditions, and so on. And these variables, they explain relatively well the distribution of cropland globally in 1992 or even in 2015, but they are really poor to explain cropland expansion. Well, here in this period, we use 1992 to 2015. Yep.
I mean, that's interesting because then it makes you wonder, well, have things just not settled yet? So that, the new areas are hard to predict what people are going to do, but eventually it's predictable. And, is that true or not? And then if that's the case, it's interesting how you said that even a small difference in expectation of profit could have a big influence on whether people, I guess, convert the area into intensive commercial use or whatever. So I'm just wondering, because those things seem to be almost contradictory possibilities, that it's actually hard to predict, or that ultimately it's going to be easy to predict, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's hard to predict. I think that is so I think the point is that it's hard to predict with standard economic theories. And one of the reasons is this notion of abnormal rents that I used, which is that in these imperfect market conditions where tenure is not secure, information is not widespread, the rule of law, even for contracts, is not always very much enforced in many of these frontier regions. So it makes it that if you calculate the rent that can be extracted from land from like perfect market conditions, this does not necessarily reflect the actual profit that some actors are able to derive from the land. Those actors that have the good connections, the political connections, which can receive a land title, or those actors who are sufficiently capitalized that they can build their own roads and they do not depend on the government roads or things like that, they can actually generate a much higher rent from the land than what standard economic theory would predict. And I think as long as we don't have the proper data on all these different investors and their assets and the capacities, it's hard to predict what is the actual rent that they could derive from the land. And on top of that, yes, there is this expectation things, which makes it that part of the profit that you may derive does not exist today, but might exist if sufficient number of people believe in the same thing as you do. And okay, so that's also a thing in these like pioneering farmers in Northern Mozambique. Many of these farmers, I mean, some of them are there maybe to become rich, but in reality, many of them are not there to become rich. They are there for many different motives, because they want to have a free space, because they live like this kind of life, because they are Christian farmers and they want to contribute to Christian development or whatever, or various reasons. So in a sense, the actual profit that you can calculate from their farming does not explain their presence there either.
Great, thanks.
A number of people are there for, let's say, non-profit reason. They can create the agglomeration economies that can actually allow the profit-oriented ones to come in.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what we see in the region, where many of these very large companies like Cargill and others, they are not actually active in the region, but they are present in the region. They have an eye on it, and I think they are to some extent waiting for the conditions to be more favorable to invest. Okay.
Great. Anybody else with a question? Oh, Yavinder, you're muted.
I'll pitch in a question. You showed in an early slide this comparison with the Cerrado frontier region of Brazil, and obviously this is a very different region in social economic context and resources. But I'm wondering, in your overall model, what do you see are possible parallels and key differences between the Brazilian frontier and this Southern African frontier?
Okay, so first, I mean, the picture was really there to tell people that it was the same, but in reality, even from the climatic and soil conditions and so on, it's very different. So many Brazilian farmers who tried or who explored the region went back and said, this is really not the Cerrado. So from the agronomic point of view and so on. But then I think the more important differences are from the human point of view. These are regions that are quite densely populated in a sense, even though sometimes it doesn't look densely populated. There's a lot of people there doing agriculture since a long time. There's in Mozambique in particular, a very active civil society with lots of civil society organizations and so on, which have been pushing back a lot to investors, including investors from Brazil and elsewhere. So I don't think that this region can really take a trajectory of super large agriculture like in the Cerrado and some frontiers in the Cerrado, because there's already too many people. But still, I think if it really becomes attractive for commercial investors, and that is some of the discussions that are ongoing in Mozambique to revise the land law to create more of a land market. And if that happens, then I think still it's possible for investors to quickly consolidate land by acquiring land titles from communities and to develop some kinds of larger scale agriculture. But the people that are there are still going to make the trajectory very different, because yeah, you cannot find 50,000 hectares in one row with no people there. That's just impossible.
Great. I'm going to abuse my rights and jump in with the question while others are thinking. I had a question about how you weave in kind of broader political contexts into the different forms of analysis. So you mentioned the insurgency in Northern Mozambique. So that raises, I think, a lot of questions. One, about how is it relevant to the kinds of work you're doing theoretically, but also kind of logistically, it makes it very difficult to do certain types of work and ethnography, locally based field work, for example, whereas obviously with the remote sensing and things, doesn't matter what's happening on the ground, you can just carry on. So that's kind of one of my questions, like how does the kind of wider political context influence the work? And the second is a question really around how mining kind of considerations feed into your understanding of the dynamics around frontiers? Is it purely just in terms of the expectations around what mining might bring, or I guess with small scale mining, for example, there can be a lot of movement of labor around countries, and there's reasonably well established small scale mining economy in Mozambique, and how is it possible to kind of incorporate kind of an ever expanding kind of range of things which might seem relevant? I don't know if that makes sense.
Okay, how the political context matters. Of course, logistically, it's not the time to go doing fieldwork in Cabo Delgado province. That is very clear. Well, I think for us it was reasonably okay because we had collected a lot of data already. So it was okay, but I think it's going to be challenging for continuation and for what's happened next. But I think yes, of course, it's more it's challenging theoretically also. I think I mean, to some extent, it's the reality in other places also, and that things are sometimes contingent and moving fast. But in this specific case, I think it really reminds us that we have to be extremely careful about any kind of trajectories of projections that you can make about what these places can become. And so, yes, of course, to some extent, the original hypothesis of the project is that this region might turn into a much more active, fastly developing land use expansion and deforestation frontiers. And to some extent, it makes sense for a number of reasons, but just for these security reasons alone, it's certainly not going to happen very soon because it's just impossible. So I think it does not invalidate some of the conclusions that we can make about the fact, for example, that people's expectation influence on land use dynamics, about the fact that some of these past ways that can also influence the future trajectories, but it shows that reality is certainly not like unidirectional and linear. About the mining, so that is really something that came up along the way. The project was really not supposed to be focusing on mining, but that was the reality from the ground. And okay, I did not enter into all the details, but it influences land use dynamic in different ways. So one was these expectations from these commercial farmers about new markets, but another one was that a number of communities are resettled because of these mining projects. The company comes, and then when they want to acquire a title and operate in an area where there's people, they negotiate the resettlement of the community to another place and to another land. So this creates movements of populations. And that's something that we wanted to investigate, but we don't yet have really the time. But to what extent the fact that many of these resettlements, or I mean, at least that's a hypothesis, is that many of these resettlements take place towards more marginal lands. People have been farming relatively good land, but they are resettled to relatively more marginal lands. And so in theory, all other things being equal, it should increase the land use demand. They would have lower yields if they farm on more marginal lands. And so for the same village resettled, you would have to clear a lot of new land. This is something we want to investigate, but we're not yet there. We're still in the fabrication of the land use maps to do that. And there also the expectation of the people mattered, because the expectation that they could indeed benefit from the economic development of the mining activities in many cases facilitated this resettlement. So people who said, okay, I'm not super happy to give up my good agricultural land and be resettled on more marginal land, but if I see this in a perspective of maybe new job opportunities, then I can accept that. So there's a number of ramifications of land use connections with mining.
Great.
Yep.
Anybody else have a question?
I can ask a quick one.
Great.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I also have further questions, but carry on. Yeah.
Well, again, hopefully I can clearly explain where it was in your talk, but you had a map towards the end of the talk that was showing, sort of in different colors where there was commercial development and subsistence development, et cetera. And then you had another map that talked about uncertainty. I was wondering if we could go to that, if you could explain the uncertainty map, what that was referring to. I just, yeah.
Yep, of course. So it's this one, right?
No, actually, well, no, this one, yeah, that one. Oh,
Yep.
sorry. I think there was a delay in Zoom. It was, yeah, it's that one.
Yeah,
that one.
it's that one. Okay, so this is the result from the Bayesian modeling. So we use this a set of GIS layers about land cover to see where there is land that is already agriculture versus not yet agriculture, maps of population density, maps of accessibility and commercial activity, and so on, to identify on the map on the left. So where are these places which are more like subsistence frontiers with relatively low population density and relatively abundance of unconverted land versus those where there is presence of commercial activity. So this is the map on the left, and then on the right, it's basically the uncertainty on the map on the left. So it's just to show that in some of these places, which have relatively low uncertainties, we are relatively confident that, in fact, yes, these places are as they are. So if you look at Northern Mozambique there, for example, we have a relatively high confidence in these areas that, yes, this is smallholder land, not a lot of commercial activity, low population density, and so on. But in some of other places, we have higher uncertainties, and it's really just uncertainties related to the fact that the variable that we use are proxies, and so we convey with that the fact that we might look like they have commercial activity, but in reality not so much. Or some places might look like there's agglomeration economies, but in reality they're not really so developed there, and so on. So it's the uncertainty is on the
Okay, of the data, because it looks, is it possible that the uncertainty just seems to be around areas where there's emerging commercial frontiers in particular?
Probably, yes. So it's the it's the uncertainty in the data, but the uncertainty in the data that went through the Bayesian model. And so this is how Bayesian network function. They somehow they I don't say they create uncertainty, but they try to reflect the fact that these data sets have uncertainties, and the location, how we describe these places have uncertainties.
Oh, okay.
And it's possible that these, well, I have not looked very much in detail yet, but it's quite possible that these uncertainties are more higher in these emerging commercial frontiers and in established markets. Yep.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay. Thanks.
Anybody else like to jump in? Another question I had was you talked about the kind of some of the gaps in data availability and how challenging that makes it to really understand what's happening in some of these areas. So my question really is, in terms of really enhancing and developing our understanding of the dynamics around frontiers, what would you see as the kind of key data or kind of gaps in knowledge in terms of understanding the dynamics of why frontiers are developing the way they are?
That's a good question. Okay, there's many, but okay, some of the gaps is some of the things that we're trying to contribute with in terms of data about the investors, who they are, what they do, what they want. And that's what I was saying in the beginning. I think there's a lot of works about impacts of this kind of investments on smallholders, but still a relative scarcity of work about why these people invest, how they do, and so on and so on. There's a, okay, that's what I showed a little bit with the cadastral data, but that's a problem that we have with the community lands. For example, there's a lot of gaps in the data about policies and like land use policies, the spatial extent of these different policies, also about temporal outline or course of these policies, which kind of land use zoning happen when, and that is quite important if we want to assess their impacts on land use trajectories. And then another data gap that we're trying to work on now is that we do have land use maps that identify cropland or forest, but what we're really missing is land use maps that can actually identify smallholders, medium-scale farmers, large-scale commercial farmers. And so this is something that we're trying to work on from the remote sensing, to really have maps that where we can see these interactions in the landscape, projects, small-scale farming, to what extent large-scale agriculture has different trajectories than smallholder farmings in terms of how these different kinds of farming expand on forest versus grassland versus already cleared land, and marginal land, good land, and things like that. And for that, we need to really have the data that identifies small-scale farming versus large-scale commercial farming.
So much work to be done, eh?
Yeah, that's why I say, honestly, there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Yep. I don't know, maybe if there's more questions, or if,
Yeah.
okay, I know that there was a lot, but that was also an exercise for me. I'm trying to pull together the different threads of the project, which is not an easy task. So maybe it was a little bit like going very quickly on many of these things, but I hope still it was interesting and useful.
No, absolutely. It's fascinating and really challenging thing to do. We've worked on fairly large scale interdisciplinary work, and it is huge amount of work actually in bringing it all together or trying to draw the connections with massively disparate methodologies, ontologies, epistemologies, associated with all these ideas, and so yeah, it's really great to kind of to see how you're approaching it and trying to do it. That was huge. Thank you to you for sharing that. Sounds like we may have to invite you back again at some point. How long is the project going on?
Officially, it's finishing next year. I think we'll still have some outputs to work on after that, but
always, yeah. No, that's brilliant. So yeah, thanks, Patrick. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks.
Great to have you along, and do have a look at the other OCTF seminars. There's a huge range of things that get talked about. So Jane posted in the chat the link, and hope everyone has a nice weekend. Otherwise, and I'm sure if you want to hang on, then that'd be fine. Otherwise, very nice to see you all, and see you again soon.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks very much.
Many thanks.